As for the primitive tradition, while it has lost the prestige attaching to occultism, and while on the other hand its foundations are inadmissible in that it derives all its precepts and all its affirmations from a source which it has itself declared to be forever inaccessible, incomprehensible, and unknowable, it is known the less true, if we ignore this defective foundation, that these affirmations and precepts are the most unlooked for, the loftiest, the most admirable, and the most plausible that mankind has hitherto known. Have we the right, for example, to reject a priori, as a puerile fancy, wholly unsupported, the conception of the fall of man, which we cannot verify, when close beside it, almost contemporary with it, we find another disaster, equally general, that of the worldwide, prehistoric deluges and cataclysms which the geologists have actually verified? With what profound truth may not this legend of a superhumanity, happier and more intelligent than ours, correspond? So far we know nothing of it. But neither did we know what corresponded with the tradition of the great catastrophes before the annals of these upheavals, inscribed in the bowels of the earth, revealed to us what had occurred. I might mention a large number of traditions of this sort, the intuitions of genius or immemorial truths, to which science is today returning, or is at least discovering their vestiges. I have already spoken of the successive appearance of the various forms of life precisely in the order assigned to them by the paleontologists. To these we must add the preponderant part played by the ether, that cosmic, imponderable fluid, the bridge between mind and matter, the source of all that which the primitive religion called a kosa, and which by constant repetition becomes the telesma of Hermes Trismegistus, the living fire of Zoroaster, the generative fire of Herodotus, the ignis subtilissimus of Hippocrates, the astral light of the Kabbalah, the pneuma of Galen, the quintessence or azote of the alchemists, the spirit of life of Saint Thomas Aquinas, the subtle matter of Descartes, the spiritus subtilissimus of Newton, the odd of Reichenbach and Caude-Duprel, the infinite ether, mysterious and always in movement, whence all things come and whither all return, to which our scientists, in their laboratories, are at last obliged to have recourse in order to account for a host of phenomena which without it would be utterly inexplicable. All that our chemists and physicists call heat, light, electricity, and magnetism was for our ancestors merely the elementary manifestations of a single substance. Thousands of years ago they recognized the presence and the all-powerful intervention of this ubiquitous agent in all the phenomena of life, just as they described, long before our astronomers, the birth and formation of the stars, just as the pretended myth of the transmutation of the metals, which they bequeathed to the alchemists of the Middle Ages, is likewise confirmed by the chemical and thermal evolution of the stars, which, as Charles Nordman remarks, offer us a perfect example of this transmutation, since the heavier metals appear only after the lighter elements and when they have cooled sufficiently. And lastly, since we must draw the line somewhere, just as they taught, in opposition to the scientists of a fairly recent period, that the duration of the universe, the ages of the earth, and the time which will elapse between its birth and its destruction must be increased to millions of centuries, since a day of Brahma, which corresponds with the evolution of our world, contains 4,320 millions of years. Our forebears had also an unexpected tradition concerning yet another problem, more inspiring and more essential, since it involves the fundamental law of our universe. Of this tradition, humanity will never be able to verify more than an infinitesimal portion. They tell us that the cosmos, the visible manifestation of the unknown and invisible cause, has never been and will never be other than an uninterrupted sequence of expansions and contractions, of evaporations and condensations, of sleeping and waking, of inspirations and expirations, of attractions and repulsions, of evolution and involution, of materialization and spiritualization, of interiorization and exteriorization, as Dr. Jaworski observes, who has discovered an analogous principle in biology. The unknown cause awakens, and for thousands of millions of years suns and planets radiate energy, dispersing and scattering themselves, spreading throughout space. It sleeps again, and for thousands of millions of years the same worlds, hastening from every point of the horizon, attracting one another, concentrating, contracting, and solidifying until they form without perishing. For nothing can perish, only one soul mass, which returns to the invisible cause. It is precisely in one of these periods of contraction or inhalation that we are living. It is ruled by that vast, mysterious law of gravitation, of which no one can say whether it is electricity or magnetism or a spiritual force, although it is predominant over all the other laws of nature. If all bodies, so Newton tells us, had from all eternity, without beginning, mutually attracted one another in direct proportion to their mass, and inversely as the squares of their distances, all the substance of the universe sought by now to form nothing but an infinite mass, unless we presuppose an absolute and immovable equilibrium which would amount to eternal immobility, in the perpetual motion of the heavenly bodies, in which the displacement of an atom would disturb it. It does not seem possible that this equilibrium could exist. As a matter of fact, it is almost certain that it does not exist, and the apex, that mysterious spot in the celestial sphere, not far from Vega, toward which our solar system is hurling itself with all its retinue of planets, may possibly be, as far as we are concerned, its point of rupture and one of the first phases of the great contraction, which, according to the latest calculations of the astronomers, will take place in 400,000 years' time. But if it is fact that this terrible contraction must almost inevitably occur, the universe will one day be no more than a monstrous mass of matter, compact, infinite, and probably forever lifeless, outside which nothing could possibly find place. Would this illimitable mass, consisting of the total sum of all cosmic matter, including the etheric and all but spiritual fluid that fills the fabulous interstellar spaces, occupy the whole of space, finally and eternally congealed in death? Or would it float in a void more subtle than that of etheric space, and henceforth subject to other forces? It seems as though the fundamental law of the universe must result in a sort of annihilation, a blind alley, an absurdity, while on the other hand, if we deny this universal attraction or gravitation, we are denying the only phenomenon which we can establish as indisputable, and all the heavenly bodies will be absolutely uncontrolled by law. The imagination, the intuition, the observations, or the traditions of our forefathers past this dead point. Behind their mythical or mystical phraseology they pondered the universe, regarding it as an electrical phenomenon, or rather as a vast source of subtle and incomprehensible energy, obeying the same laws as those which control magnetic energy, in which all is action and reaction, in which two antagonistic forces are always face to face. When the poles of the magnet are reversed, attraction is followed by repulsion, and centripetal by centrifugal force, while gravitation is opposed by another law which as yet is nameless, but which redistributes matter and the worlds, in order to recommence a new day of Brahma. This is the solve et coagula of the alchemists. This, obviously, is merely a hypothesis, some aspects of which cannot be maintained save by certain electrical and magnetic phenomena, and the properties of radioactive bodies, and which as a whole cannot of course be verified. But it is interesting to note once again that this hypothesis, the most majestic, the boldest, and also the most ancient, being indeed the first of all, is perhaps the only one to which science might rally without derogation. Here again have we not the right to ask ourselves whether our forefathers were not more far-sighted, more perspicacious than we, and whether we ourselves are capable of imagining so vast and so probable a cosmogony as theirs. If now from these heights we return to mankind, we shall discover intuitions or convictions of no less remarkable a nature, without venturing ourselves amid the complexity of subdivisions which, after all, are of later date and would lead us too far afield. We shall confine ourselves to saying that in all the primitive doctrines, which agree in a most remarkable fashion, man is composed of three essential parts: a perishable physical body, a spiritual principle, a shadow or astral double, likewise perishable, but much more durable than the body, and an immortal principle which, after more or less protracted developments, returns to its origin, which is God. Now we can prove that in the phenomena of hypnotism, magnetism, mediumship, and somnambulism, in all that concerns certain extraordinary faculties of the subconsciousness, which seem independent of the physical body, and also in certain manifestations from beyond the grave, which today can hardly be denied, our metapsychical sciences are in a sense obliged to admit the existence of this astral double, which everywhere extends beyond the physical entity and is able to leave it, to act independently of it and at a distance, and in all probability to survive it, which seems once again, and in an extremely important connection, to justify the almost prehistoric intuitions of our Hindu and Egyptian ancestors. As I have only too often repeated, we might multiply such instances, and when our science has thus confirmed one of these intuitions or traditions, it would be only sensible to regard such as are still awaiting this confirmation with a little more confidence. The greater the number of instances in which it has been proved that they were not mistaken, the greater the chances that they are in the right in respect of other instances which cannot yet be verified. Very often these latter are the most important, being those which affect us most directly and profoundly. We must not as yet draw too general or too hasty conclusions. Rather let us, as a result of these first confirmations, or beginnings of confirmations, accord a provisional and vigilant credit to the other hypotheses. When we have finally verified these first instances, we shall not be out of the wood, but we shall be a great deal nearer the open sky than we were, which is as much as we have the right to hope or demand from any religious or philosophical system, or even from any science. To say nothing of the fact that the least advance here, at the center of all things, is of incomparably greater importance than an advance along a diameter or on the circumference, since from this hub or center spring all the spokes of that vast wheel of which science has barely examined the outer rim. It must be admitted once for all that we cannot understand or explain anything. Otherwise we should be no longer men but gods, or rather the one God. Apart from a few mathematical and material proofs whose essential drift we cannot after all perceive, all is hypothetical. We have nothing but hypotheses on which to order our lives, if we cease to count upon certainties which will probably never emerge. It is therefore of great importance that we should select our vital hypotheses carefully, accepting only the noblest, the best, and the most credible. And we shall find that these are almost invariably the most ancient. In the hierarchy of evolution, we shall never know that central or supreme being, nor his latest thought. But for all that we must do our best to learn a great deal more than we do know. That we cannot know everything is no reason for resigning ourselves to knowing nothing. And if branches of knowledge other than science, properly or improperly so called, are able to help us, to lead us farther or more rapidly, we shall do well to interrogate them, or at least not to reject them beforehand without due investigation, as has hitherto been done only too readily and only too often. Among these assertions and these doctrines that cannot be verified, we shall consider only those that concern us most intimately, and notably those which touch upon the conduct of our lives, on the sanctions, the responsibilities, the compensations, and the moral philosophy that proceed therefrom, on the mysteries of death, the life beyond the tomb, and the final destinies of mankind. Hitherto almost all the doctrines which touch upon these points have been, for us Europeans, esoteric, hidden away in the scrolls of the Kabbalah or the Gnosis, the persecuted, humble, and Haggadahs of the Hindu, Egyptian, Persian, and Chaldean wisdom. But since the Sanskrit texts have been deciphered, they are so no longer, at least in their essential elements. For although, as I have already stated, we are far from being acquainted with all the sacred books of India, and are perhaps even farther from having grasped the secret meaning of the hieroglyphs, nevertheless it is by no means likely that any fresh revelation or complete explanation would be of a nature seriously to unsettle what we already know. No rule of conduct, no moral philosophy could be derived from the unknowable first cause, the one unmanifested God. It is indeed impossible to know what he desires or intends, since it is impossible to know him. To discover a purpose in the infinite, in the universe, or in the deity, we are compelled to cast ourselves adrift on the unprovable, and to cross great gulfs of a logic of which we have already spoken, evoking from this cause, which to manifest itself has divided itself, one God or many, emanations from the unknowable, who suddenly become as familiar as though they had issued from the hands of man. It is obvious that the ethical basis resulting from this arbitrary procedure will always be precarious, offering itself merely as a postulate which must be accepted with closed eyes. But it is worthy of note that, following upon this preliminary operation, or concurrently with it, in all the primitive religions, we shall find another which is, as it were, its necessary and, in any case, its invariable consequence, the voluntary sacrifice of one of these emanations of the unknowable, who becomes incarnate, renouncing his prerogatives, in order to deify humanity by humanizing God. Egypt, India, Chaldea, China, Mexico, Peru all know the myth of the child God born of a virgin. And the first Jesuit missionary to China discovered that the miraculous birth of Christ had been anticipated by Fouquet, who was born 3,468 years before Jesus. It has very truly been said that if a priest of ancient Thebes or Heliopolis were to return to earth, he would recognize, in Raphael's painting of the Virgin and Child, the picture of Horus in the arms of Isis. The Egyptian Isis, like our own Immaculate Virgin, was represented standing on a crescent moon and crowned with stars. Devaki also is depicted for us bearing in her arms the divine Krishna, while Ishtar, in Babylon, holds the infant Tammuz on her knees. The myth of the Incarnation, which is also a solar myth, is thus repeated from age to age, under different names, but it is in India, where it almost certainly originated, that we find it in its purest, loftiest, and most significant form. Without lingering over the doubtful incarnations of the Hermes, the Manus, and the Zoroasters, which cannot be historically verified, let us consider, among the many incarnations of Vishnu, the second person of the Brahman Trinity, only the two most famous. The eighth, which is that of Krishna, and the ninth, which is that of Buddha. The approximate date of the earlier incarnation is given us by the Bhagavad Gita, which gives prominence to the wonderful figure of Krishna. The Catholic Indianists, fearing with all their too narrow point of view that the incarnation of Krishna might endanger that of Christ, admit that the Bhagavad Gita was written before our era, but maintain that it has since been revised. As it is difficult to prove such revisions, they add that if it is actually proved that the Bhagavad Gita and other sacred books of an equally embarrassing character are really anterior to Christ, they are the work of the devil, who, foreseeing the incarnation of Jesus, purposed by these anticipations to lessen its effect. However this may be, the purely scientific Indianists William Jones, Colebrook, Thomas Strange, Wilson, Princeps, et al. Agree in the opinion that it dates from at least 12 or 14 centuries before our era. It is in fact commented upon and analyzed in the Modana Ratna Pradeepa, a selection from the texts of the most ancient lawmakers, in Vrihaspati, in Parasara, in Narada, and in a host of other works of indisputable authenticity. According to other Orientalists, since the truth must be told, the poems upon Krishna are no older than the Mahabharata, which after all takes us back 2 centuries before Jesus Christ. As for the incarnation of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, or Sakyamuni, no doubt is any longer possible. Sakyamuni was a historical personage who lived in the 5th century before Christ. All this, moreover, is well enough known. It is needless to labor the point. But what can be the secret meaning of a myth so immemorial, so unanimous, so disconcerting? The unknown cause of all causes, subdividing itself, descending from the heights of the inconceivable, sacrificing itself, circumscribing itself, and becoming man that it might make itself known to men. Would not all the possible interpretations be unreasonable did we refuse to see, beneath this incomprehensible myth, yet another confession, this time more indirect, better disguised, more profoundly concealed, of the fundamental agnosticism, the sublime and invincible ignorance of the great primitive teachers? They knew that the unknowable could give birth to nothing but the unknown. They knew that man could never know God, and this is why, no longer searching in a direction in which all hope was impossible, they directly approached humanity as the only thing with which they were acquainted. They said to themselves, "It is impossible for us to know what God is, or where He is, or what He purposes. But we do know that, being everywhere and everything, He is necessarily in man, and that He is man. It is therefore only in man and through man that we can discover His purpose." Under the symbol of the incarnation, they thus conceal the great truth that all the divine laws are human. And this truth is only the reverse of another truth, of no less magnitude. Namely, that in mankind is the only God that we can ever know. God manifests Himself in nature, but He has never spoken to us save by the voice of mankind. Do not look elsewhere. Do not seek in the inaccessible infinity of space the God whom you are eager to find. It is in you yourself that He is hidden, and it is in you yourself that you must find Him. He is there, within you, no less than in those in whom He appears to be incarnated in a more dazzling fashion. Every man is Krishna, every man is Buddha. There is no difference between the God incarnate in them and Him who is incarnate in you. But they found Him more easily than you have done. Imitate them and you will be their peer. And if you cannot keep up with them, you can at least give ear to what they tell you. For they can but tell you what the God who is within you would tell you, if you had learned to listen to Him as they have listened. There we have the foundation of the whole of the Vedic religion. and of all the esoteric religions which have sprung from it. But at its source the truth will hardly be enwrapped in symbols or transparent myths. There is nothing secret about it. Often, indeed, it declares itself aloud, without reticence and without disguise. When all the other gods are no more than disappearing names, says Max Miller, there are left only the Atman, the subjective self, and Brahma, the objective self, and the supreme knowledge is expressed in these words. Tat Twam, Haktit. That is you, your true self, that which cannot be taken from you when all has disappeared that seemed for a time to be yours. When all created things vanish like a dream, your true ego belongs to the eternal self. The Atman, the personality within you, is the true Brahma. That Brahma from whom birth and death divided you for a moment, but who receives you again into his bosom, so soon as you return to him. The Rig Veda, or the Veda of the hymns, the true Veda, the Veda par excellence, continues Max Miller, ends in the Upanishads, or, as they were afterwards called, the Vedanta. Now the dominant note of the Upanishads is know thyself. That is, know the being who is the upholder of your ego. Learn to find him and to know him in the eternal and supreme being, the one alone, who is the upholder of the whole universe. This religion at its ultimate height, the religion of the Vanaprastha, that is, of the old man, the man who has paid his 3 debts, whose eyes have beheld the son of his son and who withdraws into the forest, becomes purely mental. And finally self-examination, in the profoundest meaning of the word, that is, the recognition of the individual self as one with the eternal self, becomes the only occupation which is still permitted to him. Search for the me hidden in your heart, says the Mahabharata, the final echo of the great doctrine. Brahma, the true God, is you yourself. This, let me repeat, is the foundation of Vedic thought, and it is from this thought that all the rest proceeds. To recover it we have no need of modern theosophy, which has but confirmed it by less familiar texts whose authority is less assured. It was never secret, but by its very magnitude it escaped the gaze of those who could not understand it. And little by little, as the gods multiplied and stepped down to the level of mankind, it was lost to sight. Its very nobility made it esoteric. In the heroic age of Vedism, when almost all men, having done their duty to their parents and their children, used to withdraw into the forest, there peacefully to wait for death, retiring within themselves and seeking there the hidden God with whom they were soon to be confounded. It was the thought of a whole people. But the peoples are not long faithful to the heights. To avoid losing all touch with them it was forced to descend, to conceal its features, to mingle with the crowd in 1,000 disguises. Nevertheless we always discover it beneath the increasingly heavy veils with which it cloaks itself. Man is the key to the universe, declared the fundamental axiom of the medieval alchemists, in a voice stifled beneath the litter of illegible texts and undecipherable conjuring books, as Novalis, perhaps without realizing that he was rediscovering a truth many thousands of years old, indeed almost as old as the world, once more repeated it in a form scarcely altered, when he taught that our first duty is the search for our transcendental ego, abandoned in an infinite universe in which we cannot know anything but ourselves. Is not this, as a matter of fact, the only truth that has survived, the only one that is not illusory, and the only one to which we might still hope to return, after so many misadventures, so many erroneous interpretations in which we failed to recognize it?